Doctors of Reddit, what made you say how the is this person still alive? Witnessed a sedan with a trailer flipped 4 times at 75 miles per hour on a highway into a ditch right in front of me. A 12-year-old wasn't wearing a seatbelt and was thrown from the vehicle through an open window. He had a superficial laceration of his leg and was in shock, but otherwise apparently unharmed. We did a quick trauma evaluation of the family. Everyone seemed okay and applied pressure to the kid's bleeding leg until EMS got there. When we were running to the wrecked car as the dust was settling, I was sure we were just going to see disembodied pieces of that kid everywhere. But he was really lucky. Wear seatbelts, folks. Everyone who remained buckled in the car didn't even have a scratch. Not a doctor but a student nurse. I had a patient come into the psych ward from the emergency department after he had cut off his own right arm from the elbow down with a line chainsaw. He only survived because he apparently had some kind of rare clotting disorder that prevented him from bleeding to death. He was severely schizophrenic and believed that his arm was going to grow back. I didn't expect this to blow up the way it did. I love this story because my dad was a psychiatrist. And I finally have something way weirder than any of the tales of his profession he ever told. Happy you all found it as interesting as I did. Not a doctor, but firefighter. We had a 30-year-old male put a shotgun in his mouth pointing up to his nose, pull the trigger and survive. We show up, work him. He's breathing, but missing most of his face, and we transport him. He survives and we are all amazed. 3 months later he does it again. But 22 to the temple, it bounced around and exited through his eye. He survives again, with some mental deficits and a glass eye. But still one of the craziest I've seen. Not a doctor, but I do have a story. Friend of a friend. She was hiking and got a scratch on her leg. Later that night she wasn't feeling well, so she went to the hospital. They said it was flu and sent her home. She went back the next day and was diagnosed with sepsis. She wound up in a medically induced coma and had to lose all 4 of her limbs and have a lot of internal issues as well. She's doing great now with prosthetics and an amazing attitude. I helped take care of an old dude who had one leg amputated and had broken his other leg, so he was seeing us because of that. He was on oxygen and not being very compliant with using his wheelchair. We were talking with him and he was getting really argumentative. How am I supposed to chop wood in a wheelchair? Was what he kept demanding. When asked how he was chopping wood with one leg in the first place, he responded that he'd crawl into the woods and hop up to chop the wood. This was even more concerning when the doctor asked how he was carrying his axe, oxygen, and the wood he chopped. He looked him straight in the eye and said, "I carry Sim on my back." Not sure if he was serious, but he was pretty dang grizzled and looked like he may have been crawling through the woods. Older woman called 911 for chest pain. Her vital signs were, and she had the look that anyone who's ever seen a patient about to die will recognize instantly. Her EKG suggested multiple blockages in her coronary arteries, and we had to put her on a ventilator shortly after she got to the ER because she deteriorated so quickly. Cath lab confirmed the EKG findings. Complete blockage of one artery and 99% blockage of 2 other major arteries. Unfortunately, it was too extensive to resolve with PCI. So the only option was to fly her to the university hospital in the city for an emergent triple bypass. It turned out that she'd had multiple episodes like this, but not quite as severe, over the last 6 months, and had refused bypass surgery not once, not twice, but 3 times in favor of a Mediterranean diet. Well, at this point she didn't have much say anymore and family agreed. So off to the OR she went. I took care of her again about 4 months later and she actually seemed to have made a remarkable recovery. As a student, had a young guy come in who self-inflicted a 22 to the inside of his mouth and passed out. Awoke the next morning. Didn't recall the night prior. Went to work. 2 hours into work he says he's not feeling right and starts acting odd. Coworkers call EMS. They take him in, and while the ED is working him up, they notice a mix of clear fluid and blood in the back of his mouth. They call ENT and get a CT head. Shows 11 or so bullet fragments throughout his noggin. The guy was acting by that time completely unfazed. I was very fazed. Edit. Kind of a retelling, but one time a cadaver on which I was performing an autopsy had a lung which was flipped upside down. When I tried to flip it to the proper position, bloop, it flipped right back to upside down. After some due diligence, we realized the lung was a transplant. The surgeons who performed the transplant had attached the organ incorrectly. The lung had been fighting to be upside down its whole life in this other man. After 15 or so years, the man eventually moved in a way that allowed it to flip over, resulting in his death. Not really a how the is this person still alive, but more of a how the did this person live this long with this condition. Best one I saw was a guy shot in the back, half an inch from his spine. He was totally stable, sitting and talking to us. We saw the bullet sitting in between his SVC, aorta and esophagus with injuries to no vital structure. Walked out a day or two later with just a band-aid. Literal millimeter either way and he would have been a corpse. Paralyzed or needed major reconstructive surgery. Edit. A few years back, my wife was doing clinicals at the local hospital while still in school, and a guy came in with a blood sugar of 9. And he was totally conscious, lucid. As a type 1 diabetic myself, I almost fell off my chair when I heard that. 15 years ago, my mum dated a guy who had both a brain tumor and leukemia. To treat the leukemia, they had to stop treating the brain tumor and vice versa. He was given 2 years to live. He told my mum that he needed to focus on getting his affairs in order and spend time with his kids. They'd only been dating a few months. Very casually. Saw the dude a few weeks ago. Still kicking. Still has the tumor. They successfully treated the leukemia. But now he has osteoporosis, coma, and a sort of not epilepsy. They found out he had brittle bone when he had a seizure and broke a lot of bones falling down. But he's just getting on with it. Couldn't kill the guy with an axe. Working in an Aboriginal community, a woman walked in complaining of a head itch behind her eye. She was told to take a seat, and as she turned around, she had a butter knife sticking out the back of her skull. Apparently a drunk relative came home and stabbed her while she slept. Edit. Yes, she survived. Was flown back to Townsville for imaging. Then on to Brisbane for surgery. Not a doctor, but worked 7 years in an inpatient psych ward. Had lots of alcoholics come in. One came in drunk but walking. His back when tested was 68. He was awake and mostly walking. Another man took a circular saw to his inner thigh. Got 1.5 and all the way across. Somehow missed the femoral. Crazy bastard lived and had a sense of humor on day 2. Not a doctor. But March 2018, my father, who is a type 2 diabetic, ended up in the ER because of high blood sugar. Don't remember the exact number, but his blood sugar was over 1000. Handfuls of doctors and nurses told me that was easily the highest blood sugar reading they'd ever witnessed. They couldn't believe he was alive, or at least not in a diabetic coma. His blood was the consistency of syrup. You know those big 16-18-inch kitchen knives that everyone has? Had a lady come in with one sticking sideways out of her neck. Handle on the left side and top sticking out the right. She went to law, where they removed the knife in one of the most tense, arsehole clenched moments in history. Minimal bleeding. Apparently the knife split right between her major blood vessels and airway. Was lying right against them. Didn't scratch him. Absolutely incredible. Infantry guy in Afghanistan in 2009. Some old guy came up to us in a bazaar and asked us to give him a ride to a city. His arm was wrapped up. We said no, since we don't exactly do that. He unwrapped his arm. His hand wrist was missing and his 2 arm bones were exposed and white. Everything else was green and black. I have no idea how he was alive, much less up and walking around. I'm not a doctor, but I was diagnosed with Addison's at age 13 or so. Was just generally feeling lethargic. Vomiting. Dizzy. Mum calls the hospital with symptoms and they said if I had all three at the same time to come in to be safe. Orderly or whatever checks my pulse in the lobby. 30/15. He laughs, well this one's broken, and gets another machine. 30/15 wait. What? Calls a doctor. They double check it and run me to the ER for fluids. Again. Not a doctor here. But apparently that's not even high enough to have a pulse. They had no clue how I was walking, let alone conscious. But saw the numbers, and after realizing it was accurate they freaked the hell out. And of course that freaked my mom out. Them telling my mom 30/15 is the BP of a dead person did not help. And then they said it's either autoimmune or cancer. My immune system apparently ate my adrenal glands. Now I'm on meds for life. Lucky me. My resident called me urgently one night and said I needed to come to the hospital. A young man was cut in half by a train. I asked why I needed to come in. There was no way he could survive that. She explained that somehow he was maintaining his pressure and wasn't bleeding out. When I arrived, I found that the force of train had sealed off all the major vessels from the pelvis down. Crimped like a human tortellini. For me it was a guy who was cleaning his loaded shotgun and it blew half his face off. Jaw and all. He was actually pretty good from the mid-nose up. The thing that surprised me is how good of shape he was in afterwards. He didn't even go to the ICU, we just admitted him to the med-surg floor. He was up communicating via whiteboard within a few hours and was adamant that he did not try to kill himself. Got a psych consult anyway, but they agreed. Another inch dorsal with the barrel of that gun and he would have been done for. Work in a hospital. A guy showed up who had burst a tire going 180 km/h and flipped his car multiple times. His car was a write-off. The only injuries he got were a few scratches and a bruise. Edit. Thanks for internet points. No, I don't know what car he was driving. Any of the patients with flesh-eating bacteria and massive debridements. Those are always a good source of worry. A guy I know with cancer smokes 2 packs a day and drinks a fifth of Fireball every day. He lives in a trailer so dirty there is a ½ inch of dirt according to his wife's mother. He recovered from surgeries in that trailer. Eventually we got word he was quitting chemo and was just going to accept death. 5 years ago he was given 2 months to live. He is now completely cancer free. Life is just weird sometimes. 2 that stick out. Guy gets shot in the abdomen. Drops to his knees. Shooter puts one through the top of his head near his forehead. Bullet exits through his jaw. He wouldn't stop complaining about how much he hates the guy who shot him. Young girl driving a car gets T-boned on the passenger side by an Altima going at least 70 mph. Her car looks like it was hit by an IED, so we assumed she was deceased upon arrival when the other crew on scene said our focus was extricating the people in the Altima. Girl driving was completely unhurt by a Volvo. Another weird world of genetics post. Got a sample involving some kind of offbeat case where they wanted prenatal paternity testing plus analysis from my company without telling us anything about the patient in the background. As sort of a blind verification thing. The paternal test results strongly suggested that the prenatal sample appeared exclusively paternal. The fetus only had 1 set of autochromosomes. Humans have usually 2 sets. At this point we decided to stop referring to the prenatal thing as a fetus because genetically, this is generally incompatible with life. The answer? It was DNA from the products of molar pregnancy. Which I highly encourage no one to read more about, as it's pretty creepy. Not a doctor, but my former step-uncle used to work on towers, like cell phone towers. His harness broke and he fell. Landed straight on his back. Doctor said he was lucky to make it to the hospital alive and wouldn't live. 6 months later he's walking and talking again. He just has short-term memory issues and his speech is slowed down. But he can still function and be a dad. My grandfather. He had one eye from a roofing nail that flew up and destroyed it. A large scar on his forehead from an axe head flying off and the blade side hitting him. Prostate cancer. And oh yeah, he was hit by a train in his truck and was in a body cast from his armpits down for almost a year in the 50s. He lived till 96. Obligatory, not a doctor. But I am a medical radiologic technologist. And work in a cardiac cath lab with doctors. Had a patient that didn't wake up from their catheterization. Which isn't normally done with anesthesia. We just give fentanyl and Versed. We administered some Narcan to try and wake her up. Which it thankfully did. When she woke up, she freaked out and told us that in order to calm her nerves before the procedure, she did a line of cocaine before coming to the hospital. For her heart catheterization. People are incredible. Our nurse literally asked her if she was trying to kill herself because that's a damn good way to do it. Used to be an EMT. Guy was stabbed in the face with a kitchen knife. Split one eye in half. X-ray showed the knife missed his brain and the tip of the blade was less than a cm from his brainstem. Lost the eye and lived to tell about it. I understand he also broke up with his girlfriend. My wife treated a foreign student at the university she worked at who took some drug. I don't recall which. Thought he could fly. And jumped out a third-floor window. Landing directly on his face. He went into a coma and when they x-rayed him, or some other scan, they found he'd aspirated all of his teeth. It took days to figure out who he was and over a week to contact his family. I have never even considered inhaling teeth as even a remote possibility, but now I will think about it every day. I have leukemia and every doctor who I tell my story to says they don't know how I am alive and they've never seen numbers like mine. What leukemia does in very basic terms is it messes up your white blood cells and rapidly creates them. There isn't room for actual red blood cells. White blood cells. Or platelets. Those help clot when you get a cut to stop bleeding. The normal range for white blood cells is anywhere from 7 to 10, in thousands. I had 532. They don't know how I was functioning semi-normally or even still alive with that number. Not a doctor. But I am a physical rehab person. I had a patient once who went on a 3-day coke bender and did so much cocaine he had both a heart attack and a stroke. He was up and walking the week after and all his residual awkwardness pretty much cleared up. He was taken off my caseload before his discharge, but last I heard the only remaining problem he had was that he could no longer speak. I still think about how much coke he had to do to get that bad. Not a doctor. My older cousin got rear-ended at a traffic light. They took her to the ER for a basic checkup. She had no major injuries except they saw on the X-rays that she had broken her neck, and on top of that they saw that she had previously broken her neck and it had healed. She had to do the halo thing where they put screws in her head. Her family does not know of any previous accident that would have given her the first broken neck. She was always in sports all through school and college. No sports injuries. She survived having 2 broken necks. She was never paralyzed. She is perfectly healthy now. Vet here. Dog walked in. Still eating and drinking that morning but acting lethargic. Had a ruptured splenic tumor with an abdomen full of blood and a red blood cell count of 4. 1. Normal 35-55. No idea how he was still getting around. Not a doctor, but Bill had his brains blown out and was missing a large part of his skull. The swelling subsided and he lived. I am not a doctor but have had doctors say it to me after survived DVT with bilateral saddle pulmonary embolism that filled both lungs with lung die-off and right heart failure. I walked into the hospital and they were pretty much told me I was a dead person walking because my heart and lungs were slowly dying. People told me to not be upbeat because I could die right in front of them. Yeah, that was apparently a good case of what the for a good few of them, including my GP, who actually kept ringing the hospital to make sure I hadn't died on her. This May will be 3 years since that happened. Mom ran a neuro IQ and told me of this guy that came in after rebar had fallen 11 stories. Went right through the top of his skull. I know someone who launched themselves Dukes of Hazzard style off a 60-foot cliff in a Saturn. Broken arm. Concussion. A few bruises and a broken rib. Guess you don't know how to tense up when having a diabetic reaction. One of the ICU patients. He was brought in awake and alive following a gang incident. He was stabbed approximately 50 times with wounds to scalp, chest and abdomen. He was admitted to the ICU after they had repaired wounds in his heart, bowel, stomach and liver. Day 1 following his surgery. He wanted his breathing tube removed in a beer. Still wonder what he is made out of. Some days I think I met the T-1000. Not a doctor. But good story still. Some family friends of ours have a daughter. She was a toddler at the time. She was laying behind her dad's F-250 and he didn't know she was there. He backed right over her chest. Knocked her out, but other than that she sustained no other injuries and was released from the hospital after 24 hours. I think kids are squishy by design. My mom is a retired ICU nurse and had a patient, a young girl, who had been playing in shelving at a retail store. A shelf collapsed and squashed her head nearly flat. She came out of it with some slight cranial deformity and zero mental cognitive consequences. Crazy. Not a doctor. But this is something that happened to me. Had a bad stomachache one night. It was kinda painful, but I thought maybe it was bad gas or constipation or something. Woke up the next day and the stomach pain was gone, but I had a bad flu, or so I thought. A week or so later I was only getting worse. So my mom made me go to the doctor. Long story short, my appendix had ruptured the night I had a stomachache, but the pain wasn't bad enough for me to realize it was that serious. It had been ruptured for over a week. I had a long surgery to get everything cleaned up and spent 10 days in the hospital high on morphine. The surgeon and nurses kept saying how lucky I was to be alive. Story time. I am not a doctor, but this is a true story. My wife, before we were married, was ventilated and suffers from a neuromuscular disease. She's also very petite. She goes into the hospital with pneumonia and it just keeps getting worse. Yada yada yada, small details, slow decline. She tells the doctors on her whiteboard to pull the vent. She's done with it. They say that 100% doing so will be the end of her. She signs the papers and gets it done. A couple hours go by with the expected slow decline. Then she just shifts gears and powers up. Serious. Just gets steadily better minute by minute. I'm not religious, but it was a freaking miracle. Second miracle I witnessed from her was when she agreed to be my wife. Not a doctor, but was a respiratory therapist. Was working the hospice floor and we got a patient who was admitted for end-stage esophageal cancer to the point she couldn't eat and had to have an NG tube. The doctor gave her no more than a few weeks. So the weeks go by and she seems to be looking better. A few months go by and they take the NG tube out because she passed a swallow evaluation. They did a scan and she is cancer free. She was dead. She had sold her home, given personal items away, etc. as she was preparing to die. I still remember her yelling, "Well, where the am I supposed to go?" Weirdest case I have ever seen. Not a DR. But I once saw a man shot in the back of the head. His brain was exposed because his skull was blown off on top. He was gurgling and appeared lifeless. 30 minutes later he was walking to the ambulance as they arrived. Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Not a doctor but a nurse. One of my patients was a diabetic patient. I gave a high dose of 70/30 insulin while the patient was eating breakfast and had BS of somewhere in the 200s. Mind you, this dose was a scheduled dose by an endocrinologist, not a sliding scale PRN dose. After a few hours, the insulin peaked. I walked in to check on the patient and she was seizing. I called a rapid response and was checked for BS. Her BS was 16. She was given D5W and came back to normal. Considering she was a med-surg patient, I'm not entirely sure how long she was seizing for and was completely shocked she was still alive with 16 mgdl. Not a doctor but a nuclear medicine technologist. We do heart muscle viability studies. There was a man I imaged with extreme cardiomegaly who had 9 cardiac stents, 4 prior heart attacks and a left ventricular ejection fraction of 12%. He literally walked in and out of our department like nothing was wrong and refused to be hospitalized. Not a doctor. But I work with a guy who lives off Pepsi, cigarettes, and candy. On rare occasion I see him eat red meat and potatoes. Plus, he and his wife even admit that's all he'll ever eat at home. This man has stents in his legs, has had multiple heart attacks, and never stops what he's doing to himself. I don't even understand how he manages being a guy that climbs all over heavy machinery all day for a living. It's mind-boggling.